Hi there, and welcome to Lecture 2 of Unit 6. Today we're going to continue on with progressivism. In the last lecture we looked at how the movement began, where it originated, and also some of the successes that the progressives had as a grassroots movement, starting first at the local level, then working its way up to the state level. Today our topic is going to be progressivism at the national level, with really three presidents that were in office during this time period in American history when the progressive era was taking place. So we're going to take a look at Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, and see the gains that progressives made during this era, many of which are still around and relevant today. So at the national level, Teddy Roosevelt was interestingly elected as a Republican, but he really became interested in this progressive movement, and he was about making change. He made a significant amount of change while he was in office. So he ran with this program called the Square Deal. That's what his plan was going to be, and it consisted of 3 C's: regulation of corporations, which he believed were monopolizing industry, and that was bad for Americans; consumer protection in a variety of ways from corporations, but also from things that were happening in the meat packing industry, to all kinds of other issues in which consumers were being taken advantage of. And finally, conservation. Teddy Roosevelt was a great outdoorsman. He was an avid hunter. He'd gone on safaris. He loved the outdoors. And so for the first time, we have this movement to start to protect the environment, and because mining and other industries were maybe using harmful practices to the environment. So first off, the anthracite coal strike, we already talked about this, but the coal miners went on strike, and in 1902, Teddy Roosevelt sided with the workers to some extent. And this was significant because it was the first time that the government had ever sided with the workers in one of these labor disputes. Homestead strike and Pullman strike and all these strikes that we had talked about before, the government initially and the courts had always sided with the industrialists. So this gave the workers some momentum. It gave them, the feeling that the government might be with them if they continue to fight for their rights. In 1903, Roosevelt pushed through the Elkins Act, which strengthened the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Remember, the Interstate Commerce Commission was established to regulate industry, regulate the railroad industry, again, making sure that these industrialists were not taking advantage of the consumer. The Pure Food and Drug Act was a significant accomplishment. It came from the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which we talked about in the last lecture. It established the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and required labels on products listing ingredients. So it was the first step that the government took to regulate the food and drug industry because of all the accusations that were made in the jungle. Here you see Roosevelt, again a very popular president, a president that took considerable amount of action while he was in the White House. Continuing on, also as a result of the jungle, the Meat Inspection Act was passed, requiring the FDA to inspect animals in slaughterhouse conditions, making sure there weren't rats, poisoned rats, and other human body parts, thumbs and fingers, ending up in the food supply. Like I mentioned before, Roosevelt was an outdoorsman, and so he established 150 national forests and 5 national parks while he was in office. Again, the first time that the government had looked out to protect the environment. And obviously, that's such a major issue today. He prosecuted antitrust cases. The Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been passed in the 1890s, was finally enforced, again cracking down on industries that were forming together to eliminate competition, again to keep prices high. And he came up with this program called New Nationalism, which dealt with welfare to some extent, unemployment payments for those people that had lost their jobs, accident and health insurance, to some extent, something like workers' compensation. And down, you see here, Social Security for the elderly and the disabled. This would become, like the Social Security we know of today, not until the Great Depression, but this was the first step toward that. So New Nationalism was a plan to help those maybe that could not help themselves. And obviously today unemployment is a major issue in politics, whether people should receive unemployment, how long they can be on it, and so on. Here you see a newspaper article, Pure Food and Drug Act will limit human thumb levels permitted in meats. Will other fingers follow? Crater Lake National Park was one of the parks that was established by Roosevelt, along with Mesa Verde National Park. So Roosevelt, you can see, was a very progressive president, which kind of split the Republican Party, because a lot of the things that he was doing and advocating went against the conservative Republican belief, especially New Nationalism. Roosevelt chose not to run again in 1909. He went to Africa to go on a safari, and his successor, William Howard Taft, was elected, and he also was involved in the progressive movement. He was very involved in conservation, passing some of the first legislation protecting the environment from mining. He also promoted government regulation of the telegraph, the telephone, and cable, to make sure that these industries were not, again, charging ridiculous prices for these services. And in 1912, Woodrow Wilson was elected as a Democrat, and really this was the first time a Democrat had been elected since Grover Cleveland, and only the second Democrat since 1860. And how that occurred was mainly because Teddy Roosevelt decided to come back and run again as a third-party candidate, and that split the Republican vote between Taft and Roosevelt. So Woodrow Wilson was allowed to slide in, and the Democratic Party was very progressive, and so Wilson was able to pass the Federal Reserve Act, which federal banks were set up to prevent moderate cycles of boom and bust. There'd been this trend in the economy of the United States where around every 20 years through the 1800s there was an economic recession or depression, and so the Federal Reserve Act was an attempt to monitor these booms and recessions from happening. Also, the Federal Trade Commission was established to investigate corporate practices, make sure, look into trusts and industries, monopolies. Eventually, they were going to start investigating the stock market, make sure no insider information was occurring. You also had a number of amendments that were passed as a result of the progressive movement. The 16th Amendment established the graduated income tax, a nationwide income tax which would be based on the amount of money that you made. Remember, if we go all the way back to the Populist Party, this was a wish of theirs. It kind of levels the playing field to some extent to the industrialists that were making millions and millions of dollars during this era. They were going to pay more than the lower class. It was the belief of the progressives that the rich could afford to pay a larger percentage of the taxes. The 17th Amendment led to the direct election of U.S. senators. Prior to this, U.S. senators from the states were elected by the state legislators. So you had a handful of people from each state that were choosing the senators. Again, when you only have a few people, choosing who's going to be the senator or the leader, there's a much greater chance of corruption. And finally, the 18th Amendment, which was called the Noble Experiment. Many believed that alcohol was causing most of the problems in society at the time. And so for a while, they talked about, just kind of curb the sale of alcohol and limit the consumption. That was a temperance movement. Well, there were those that were, a little farther out, more radical, that wanted to completely ban the production, the sale, and the consumption of alcohol. And finally, the 18th Amendment in 1917 was passed, and it lasted for some 17 years. And it was a complete and utter failure. We'll talk more about it in the unit of the 20s when we get to, in the next unit, when it was in effect. But it led to organized crime and bootlegging and moonshine and all of these things. So it did cut down on alcoholism, but it led to greater problems. So that concludes the lecture for today. We have one more on progressivism, and that will be on the women's rights movement and female suffrage. Thank you.